The philosopher Martin Heidegger said that human beings are beings for death, because death is the most inherent, the most inevitable. We can also add that it is the most personal. I am, like many of you, an individual over 66 years old. Knowing that my remaining time is limited leads me to reflect and to deeply desire to continue existing. The intention of these videos is to show that there is a need to project oneself toward death as a more fulfilled being, without waste. In this sense, the person who wishes to continue existing must recognize themselves as an egonaut, a navigator of their own self. They do not explore galaxies or external abysses. It is a personal journey, which takes place within us, in the deepest regions of consciousness and being. The concern is genuine. I am already in the final stretch. I have witnessed the deaths of older friends, and even some close to my age. As we mentioned in the first season of these videos, there are two alternatives to death. Either there is nothing, or there is something. If in the end there is nothing, then there isn't much more to say. I shrug and swing in the hammock, carefree, convinced that everything is going to hell. But if in the end there is something, then I must focus and think about how to depart as fully as possible. Because I am the one who will bring about that final change, that journey, or whatever comes next. We have already discussed the attributes of a well-constructed soul and some ontological dangers. We must continue in this essay with this reflection. The soteriology we are using here is not the conventional one. Soter is a Greek word that literally means savior or liberator. The term has carried enormous weight, especially in contexts where salvation is understood as the only way to continue existing beyond death. One can seek advice from many people on how to be saved, but we already know what it's about. I can't pay attention to mythologies, because their answers only serve to reassure us and allow us to die peacefully, hoping for the best. They are explanations that console us in the midst of complete ignorance. But the matter of dying is serious. Becoming nothing is not a game. I have only a few years left, and I have to avoid these ontological dangers, such as mythological explanations of what happens to us in the afterlife, that only distract me from the true task, which is meta-survival. There is another fallacy we must point out: the use of testimony as proof. There are thousands of accounts of miracles and spectacular events linked to salvation, but they are still testimonies. As the book says, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." John 5 verse 31. This clarifies that individual testimony, and, by extension, collective testimony, is not sufficient to prove the truth of something. It is a fallacy similar to the ad populum fallacy. It is a faulty reasoning or fallacy because hearing many people claim something is true does not make it true. There is no quality control on what is known, and the herd instinct causes us to give up on the claims of the collective. Am I going to stake my soul on what others promote? Testimony is not necessary proof of anything. I cannot accept near-death experience accounts as true. Those experiences were not mine. Furthermore, during clinical death, the body releases a biochemical cocktail into the brain that can induce hallucinations. Near-death experiences exhibit characteristics remarkably similar to those of a psychedelic experience, both phenomenologically and neurochemically. From a phenomenological perspective, those who undergo a near-death experience often describe intense experiences that resemble those induced by psychedelics. Ego dissolution, feelings of oneness with the universe, vivid visions, distortion of time and space, and extreme emotional states such as peace, ecstasy, or terror. The perception of floating out of the body, traveling through a tunnel toward a bright light, possibly related to optic nerve disturbances, or experiencing an accelerated life review are common. These sensations are often accompanied by profound subjective intensity and a striking absence of pain. From a neurochemical perspective, near-death experiences appear to be associated with extreme brain responses to critical conditions, such as hypoxia, lack of oxygen, or reduced blood flow. In these states, there is a massive release of neurotransmitters that alter consciousness. One of the most frequently mentioned compounds is dimethyltryptamine, a potent endogenous psychedelic that may be released in large quantities during near-death moments or situations of high physiological stress. In this sense, near-death experiences can be understood as spontaneous psychedelic experiences. That is, not induced by external drugs, but with neurobiological mechanisms and subjective effects similar to those caused by substances like ketamine, a dissociative anesthetic that also produces altered states of consciousness. This relationship was explored by a study by the CONICET team in Argentina, led by neuroscientist Enzo Tagliazucchi, which compared 625 testimonies of people who had undergone near-death experiences with more than 15,000 accounts from individuals who had used psychoactive substances. The results showed that the descriptions most similar to near-death experiences came from people who had used ketamine, reinforcing the hypothesis that some of the content of these experiences has a neurochemical basis shared with certain states induced by psychedelic drugs. This experience raises fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and reality itself. Speaking of the testimonies of those who claim to have died, to what extent is their perception of the afterlife nothing more than a biochemical construction of the brain in its death throes? Furthermore, it wouldn't be surprising, given these testimonies, that many traditions interpret a transition to the otherworld as real. But it's an internal, very subjective phenomenon. It's a way for the brain to cope with its own dissolution. The person who seemed to be going to the other side didn't actually die, but rather woke up from a bad trip that evokes an altered experience of reality. Of course, the experiences of these people are similar because physiologically, we belong to the same biological species. It's common to see the tunnel of light, feel sensations of plenitude, identify with the whole, appreciate the peace that surrounds them, and so on. I am something that isn't fully constructed until my last breath. As Paul Ricoeur said, our identity is a narrative we weave throughout life. We are not born ready-made, but as a potential being, like seeds. The drones of the collective are exactly like the other animals of the species genius. They undergo a biological formation in which the path of their development, of our formation, is determined by the programs and directives of the species. Where, without consciousness, it is thought that eating, possessing objects, and reproducing intensely, pressing the hedonistic button, is fulfilling our role in life. That path is the one followed by an ordinary animal, which does not direct its growth at any point. But we are different from other animals. We undergo an ontogenetic development where our consciousness determines the course, the path, of our formation. A lot of money, time, and energy has been invested in purposeless sex, which is hedonistic, without procreation, which is a rather absurd action for intelligent beings, but understandable for drones that don't control their bodies. Sex in the absence of procreation is absurd. So why do they do it? Because it makes the limbic system happy, that's why. But it's quite absurd, really. That's why we could say that the cult of Onan is widespread, even governing and generating new ideologies, which were once condemnable but are now politically correct. We are not a fixed essence, but an existence under construction. We are essentially beings belonging to the animal kingdom, and as such, we are subject to its reproductive directives. But if we live like animals, we will die like animals. One transforms into what one loves, and if what the drones of the collective love, onanism and hedonism, that's what they will end up in, a clear animal nature. If the individual loves animal nature, that's what they will become. And in the end, there will be no transcendence, because they have become the minimal expression of their being. The person who is master of themselves, who knows themselves, is the one who is capable of changing their programming. As children, we were ourselves, ignorant of the influence of the genius of the species. In Matthew 18 verse 3, it says that unless you are converted and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven, referring to the best place after death. Therefore, as long as I have breath, my task is not to secure a promised salvation, revealed by others, a tremendous fallacy, where I remain the same as before. Rather, I must secure a salvation constructed with honesty, with the only material at my disposal, which is my own being. I do not wish to die asleep in a consoling fantasy, but awake, lucid, with a clear brow, knowing that until the end I was faithful to my quest. Dying is not giving up. It is the ultimate act of life. And if I face it with authenticity, then my death, the one that belongs to me and defines me, can also ensure my future fulfillment. Because it is not about lasting longer, but about being more. And in that being, which never ceases to be, let us find something deeper than hope, the real opportunity to continue existing. In our adventure as egonauts, exploring the deep regions of consciousness and being, we discover that a form of soteriology has always existed. A discourse on salvation that is not used as a tool, but rather imposed as an absolute truth. It is not used as a flexible map, useful for the provisional orientation of the soul, but rather pretends to be the territory itself, the ultimate, undeniable, closed reality. The symbol is confused with the thing symbolized, the story with destiny. And this is serious, because instead of understanding these soteriologies as human constructions, as cultural phenomena that can be analyzed, they are elevated to the level of the Kantian noumenon, that unknowable reality that is beyond all possible experience, revealed by mythological beings. This revelation is taken as a given, unquestionable truth, and it is worshipped simply because it was said so and for fear of succumbing to Hades or Tartarus. The argument from authority becomes dogma, and the testimony of a few becomes law for all. When a soteriology is absolutized in this way, it ceases to be a path to self-knowledge and becomes a device of obedience. It does not invite inner transformation, but submission. Instead of raising questions, it closes them. Instead of awakening, it lulls. Because if salvation has already been revealed, defined, and sealed by another, by a prophet, a book, or an institution, then the being does not explore, does not evolve. This is a great ontological danger for achieving salvation. The egonaut is guided by his own reason, without delegating it to external authorities. He does not accept others thinking for him or defining the meaning of his existence. As Kant affirmed in his call to enlightenment, life demands the courage to think for oneself, and he said, "Sapere aude," dare to know. Kant defined minority as the human being's inability to use his or her own understanding without the guidance of another. The drone lacks the courage to construct its own model of the world and adopts those already created by external authorities, be they religious, political, or cultural. Kant's exhortation to dare to know, sapere aude, is an exhortation to have the courage to create one's own models of reality. Heidegger shows something very similar when he describes the condition of the individual. He often lives under the domination of the models of reality of das Man, which tells him what to do, what to think, even what the territory of reality is like. And the drone of the collective, immersed in its onanic hedonism, does not dare to have an authentic existence. In both thinkers, Kant and Heidegger, we perceive a profound concern for the autonomy of the subject and this tendency to renounce it. That is to say, have the courage to use your own reason, stop being a drone of the collective, and emerge from the intellectual minority in which so many remain out of comfort or fear. True natural soteriology should function as a compass, not as a prison cell. It should help us walk toward a more lucid life, more coherent with our finitude and our possibility of fulfillment, not take refuge in comforting fictions. Therefore, in the next chapter, we will discuss the ontopenia of the canonical Christ. We coined the word ontopenia, inspired by the condition of osteopenia, a disease characterized by very low bone density, producing weak bones that do not support life. Ontopenia derives its meaning from its roots. Onto comes from the Greek ontos, meaning being or entity. And penia also comes from the Greek, penia, and means lack. Thus, ontopenia could be literally understood as a disease of the being, suffering from an ontological deficit, or a very impoverished being. This is the person who allowed themselves to be trapped by ontological dangers and did not grow, and their being, instead of being full, is anemic. This guarantees that after death they take nothing with them, and if it is nothing, they disappear. Their resonance vibration, their existential signature, is too poor, hopeless. It would be a kind of impoverishment of the being, a being in danger of disappearing after death because they do not have a well-constructed soul. An erroneous map imposed as reality, accepted out of fear, is a terrible deception, because it condemns the individual to exist in their minimal expression.